All right, this first problem on this practice is a pretty traditional linear function question. You might see in sort of a basic introduction to constant rates of change. So we are told that the cost of leasing a car is $800 for that down payment and fees, and then we have a monthly payment of $240. So what you really want to think about here is this 800. That's going to be our initial value. And then that monthly payment of $240, that's our absolute rate of change. So that's our constant rate of change that's being added to the amount we're paying for the car every month. And so if we lease the car for 1 year, how much will it cost you? Well, we have a monthly payment of $240. So we're going to pay that $240 12 times. And so I could do 240 times 12, and I would get a dollar amount from that of $2,880. And so this is just from the monthly payments. So that's like the total in monthly payments. But then keep in mind, we had that initial cost of $800 for leasing the car. And so we would need to take that $800 and add that to the amount we got from those monthly payments. And so we'd actually end up with a total of $3,680. And so this would be how much it would cost you to lease the car for 1 year. So the total cost for year one. Now here's the funny part. If you read the next question, how many months can you lease the car if you have budgeted $3,680 for the car? Oh, 12 months. I just found that out on part A. But let's hypothetically go through and do this question as if we didn't already know the answer to it. Like, how could I approach this question? Well, if you're thinking about your total budget of $3,680. You spent $800 of that on fees. So we can subtract out that $800 in fees, and we'd be left with $2,880. So it's like, this is how much we budgeted. There's my fees. And so then we're left with $2,880 that can be spent for those monthly payments. So how many months will this last? Well, each month costs us $240. So if we take that $2,880 and divide it by 240, we'd figure out how many months we could keep paying $240 for before we run out of money. And we'd end up with 12 months. So that's one way to do it. Another way would be to set up an equation. Remember, we sort of talked about some of us are more equation inclined, some of us are less, and sort of depending on our sort of comfort level is sort of what strategy do we want to use when tackling this problem. So let's say we are more equation inclined. We can set up our equation because we have that initial value of 800 plus 240 per month, and we have budgeted $3,680. And so I've created sort of an equation here, and I just then need to solve it. So I'd subtract 800, and I'd get 240 equals 2,880, and then I would divide by 240, and I'd end up with that 12 months that I could afford. And so I get the same answer, whichever way I think about it. And actually the process that I'm going through is exactly the same. But sometimes it helps to sort of reason and think our way through it versus just, hope that we have an equation and life just works out for us. All right, let's take a look at this next problem. So the next problem is a sort of combination of new stuff plus review stuff from Unit 1, because we're given some costs of milk. So we have in Phoenix, Arizona, a gallon of milk cost $4.27 in April 2024. Then in January 2025, the cost was up to $4.47 per gallon, and we want the absolute change in the cost of milk. So remember, that is new minus old. So our newer value is the January one, so $4.47. The old values, not equals, I want minus there, minus the older value of 4.27, and that is a 20-cent difference there. So it's 20 cents per gallon increase in that cost of milk. So now, assuming that the milk is changing at a constant rate, so that means it's going up the same amount every month, how much is the cost of milk increasing each month? So basically, I need to know how many months are passing between April to January. And I'm going to tell you, I could go through and count, but I actually Googled this question. You can Google to get the amount of time between two things. And so when I Googled it, it told me 9 months. So we're going to go with it, Google. Thank you. So 9 months and 20 cents total increase. So we take that absolute change of 20 cents and we divide it by 9. Now this comes out to not exactly a beautiful number. It's like 2's repeating. So we're just going to round it to about 2 cents per gallon increase each month. It's a little more than 2 cents, but we're rounding it, so it's an approximate. Now, based on my answer into part B, how much would I predict that the current cost of milk would be? So in this case, I'm going to use January as my initial amount. So January, it cost $4.47. Well, in February, it would then cost 2 cents more. So I could add 2 to that and it would be $4.49. And then March, I'm going to add another 2 cents and that would be $4.51 per gallon. And so that's one way to think this through, and I think that's totally a valid way to approach this problem. I could also set up a sort of more formulaic, and I might have 4.47 plus, and then I do my 2 cents over 2 months, and I would get the same answer. Now, if you did this and you made April your initial value, you're going to get a slightly different answer. Because of that rounding from our absolute rate of change. So just a heads up, if you did use April as the initial, then what's going to happen there is, so you'd start at 4.27 and you'd add those 2 cents and it'd be for 11 months. And what you'd actually find is you end up at 4.49 and you might be going, that's like 2 cents difference. And that's where that rounding of my constant rate comes into play. And that's okay. The key would just be making sure you're showing me your thought process, and I understand that then your answer might be slightly different, and that's okay. It's okay. It's sort of, what did you use as your initial value? So whether you use January versus April. Now, our last question here is a definite throwback to Unit 1, because I'm asking you to compare absolutely and in relative terms the actual cost of a gallon of milk right now in March versus my predicted. And my prediction is way off, because check it out. My predicted value was $4.51 and the actual cost was $3.89. So we're going to compare it both absolutely and relatively. So remember, an absolute would take my compared value to my standard. And we're told to make the actual cost the standard. So that I would do 451 minus 389. And I got 58 cents off per gallon. And then relative is a percent, sort of percent comparison. I take that absolute value, divide it by my standard, and turn that into a percent, and I get 14.9%. And so then I need to write a sentence. So I would say something like, the predicted cost of a gallon of milk was 58 cents or 14.9% more than the actual cost of a gallon of milk in March 2025. So things that we look for in those types of sentences, you want to talk about what is your compared value. You want that absolute and the relative difference. You want that comparison. Are they more than or less than? And then you want, what are you comparing it to? That's standard. So hopefully this sort of helps you walk through the problems. Now, obviously on Part D, if you used April as your initial value in Part C, your answers might be slightly different than mine. That doesn't mean they're wrong. Go through if you went through the same process as I did to calculate the absolute and relative change, but you used 449 instead of 451, then your answers should be correct.